You may have heard of him, whispered in tales of gaslit horror and the dark underbelly of a dazzling era. A monster in a grand hotel, a killer who built a castle of screams. But what if the sensational stories, fueled by the yellow journalism of a hungry press, obscure a truth even more chilling than fiction? This is the story of H. Holmes, a man whose real crimes were meticulously planned, his deceptions cunningly spun. Forget the amplified horrors, and let's uncover the chilling reality of America's first truly documented serial killer, separating the verified events from the sensationalized legend. The year is 1893. The world is mesmerized by the World's Columbian Exposition, a dazzling spectacle of progress and innovation in Chicago. It's called the White City, a vision of a future built on light and industry, a testament to human ambition. But in the shadows of this grand city, a different kind of ambition thrived. It was the ambition of a man who saw the city not as a place of wonder, but as a hunting ground. A man who built his own dark monument to ambition and deceit, a place the papers would come to call the Murder Castle. To understand the monster, you have to look at the boy. Born Herman Webster Mudgett in 1861 in rural New Hampshire, his childhood was marked by a cold, religious mother and a father who was a known sadist, said to have held kerosene-soaked rags over his children's mouths to quiet them when they were fussy. It was a dark, isolated upbringing that would harden his heart. His torment wasn't limited to home. He was a small, timid boy, bullied mercilessly by his peers. One day, to cure him of his fears, they locked him in a small room with a human skeleton. But when the door was opened, they didn't find a terrified child. They found a curious one. He was mesmerized, calm, and intrigued. But the fascination wasn't limited to a fear of skeletons. It was a deeper, more chilling curiosity. As a boy, he was known to capture small animals from the neighborhood, not to torment them, but to perform what he called operations. He would carefully dissect them, a morbid fascination with the inner workings of life. This early cruelty to animals is a hallmark trait of many who would go on to commit far worse atrocities. This fascination with death led him to medical school at the University of Michigan. While his peers saw the human body as a subject to be healed, he saw it as an asset. He would sneak into graveyards, steal cadavers, and disfigure them. He would then use them to fake a death, collect the life insurance policy, and sell the body for profit. He was incredibly intelligent and charismatic. He was a master of the con, and he never used violence if a scam would work instead. His life was a lie, and it was all in service of one thing: money. He had already married his first wife, Clara Lovering, back in his hometown in 1878, and fathered a son, Robert. But his ambition was far too large for a quiet life. He abandoned his family to pursue bigger, more elaborate cons. He would move from city to city, leaving a trail of broken hearts and empty promises. In Minnesota, in 1887, he met and married a young woman named Myrta Belknap. They would have a daughter, Lucy, in 1889. But Myrta had no idea that her new husband was already married. His pattern was always the same. He would charm a woman, marry her, and then use her as a pawn in his latest scheme. He would drain her savings, forge her name on documents, and then leave her behind to pursue the next con. These women were not just wives. They were tools in his grand design of fraud. In 1893, he developed a relationship with Minnie Williams, a wealthy heiress from Mississippi who moved to Chicago. He manipulated her into deeding her property in Fort Worth, Texas, to him. He later married her in a false ceremony, making her believe she was his lawful wife. Minnie's sister, Nanny Williams, eventually came to Chicago looking for her. Holmes charmed Nanny as well, taking advantage of her concern to further entangle the sisters in his schemes. Both Minnie and Nanny would vanish, becoming victims in his murder castle. Holmes did not have any children with Minnie Williams. Later, in 1894, while still married to Clara and Murda, he married his third legally recognized wife, Georgiana Yoke, a petite blonde woman in Denver. They did not have any children together. Eventually, his past caught up to him. To avoid being found, he did something radical. He shed his identity. He became a ghost, a legend. He became H. Holmes. A man of wealth and taste, with a piercing blue gaze and a neatly trimmed mustache. He was handsome, debonair, and possessed a preternatural charm that could put anyone at ease. He was the perfect con man, a perfect gentleman, a perfect monster. Holmes made his way to Chicago, a city bubbling with money, visitors, and opportunity, a city ripe for the picking. He found a job as a pharmacist, but his ambition led him to buy the store, and then the entire city block. A deal made possible by a mysterious woman and her daughter who disappeared after the sale. Holmes built a 3-story building that was a monstrous labyrinth of his own creation. A building designed for one purpose: to get people inside and never let them out. But the truth is far more chilling. He never intended to build a murder castle. He built a fortress of fraud. He would hire a carpenter to build a secret door, fire him, and hire another to build a soundproof room, fire him, and so on. He would lure unsuspecting victims with promises of jobs and a place to stay. One of his victims was a young, striking woman named Julia Connor. She was nearly 6 feet tall, with a strong spirit that had already endured the pain of a husband who had left her because of her affair with Holmes. She believed he was her future. So she and her young daughter, Pearl, moved into his hotel, and he began to promise her the world. Another victim, Emmeline Sigrand, was a beautiful young woman who had come to Chicago to see the World's Fair. She got a job working for Holmes. She had fallen in love with him and was ready to marry him, even though he was secretly married to another woman. The victims would enter through a door in their room. They would be suffocated with gas piped into the room, or trapped in an airless vault. After a victim was dead, their body would be moved through a secret chute and slid down to the basement, where Holmes waited. The entire building was a workshop of murder and deceit. Walls that were fake, doors that locked from the outside, and hallways that led to nowhere. It was a fortress of his own evil design, and his victims were its silent prisoners. In the basement, Holmes would meticulously dissect the bodies, strip them of their flesh, and sell the skeletons to medical schools. He would use acid baths, a dissection table, and a lime pit to get rid of the remaining parts of the bodies. He was so meticulous that he would sometimes re-articulate the skeletons and sell them as his work. To him, they were nothing more than a product. After the World's Fair ended, Holmes fled Chicago. As he left, he set the top floor of his building on fire, not to destroy evidence, but to collect on the insurance. he was still a con man at heart. Holmes thought he had escaped. He was a master of evasion, a chameleon. But his insatiable greed would prove to be his undoing. The White City would fade, but the evil that was born in its shadows would not. A darkness that had taken the lives of at least 9 people, but the number could have been far higher. The game that would prove to be his final downfall began with a man named Benjamin Pitezel. He was an alcoholic and a criminal. He was the perfect mark for Holmes. They hatched a plan to fake Pitezel's death and split the life insurance money. But Holmes didn't give Pitezel medicine. He gave him poison. After Pitezel was dead, he mutilated his body and hired an accomplice to stage a gruesome accident. Holmes then collected the insurance money and convinced Pitezel's grieving wife, Carrie, to give him custody of her children. He told her he would get them to her husband. She didn't know that her husband was already dead. The con was working, but one man, Pinkerton detective Frank Geyer, was already on his trail. Geyer would follow Holmes's trail of destruction across the country. He would talk to hotel clerks, bartenders, and anyone who had seen the Pitezel children. He would follow his every move, always just a step behind. Holmes would move the children from city to city, playing a cruel game of cat and mouse. He was living with his newest wife, Georgiana Yoke, and telling her he was an inventor. He was a master of lies. He had no choice. He needed to keep his new life from his old one. Geyer would discover that Holmes had murdered 2 of the children, buried their bodies, and then continued on with the youngest child, Howard. When Geyer finally caught up to him, it was too late. He found the bodies of the 2 young girls, buried in a cellar, their delicate hands twisted into a final, heartbreaking pose of prayer. Holmes was finally caught, but for the one crime he was not yet guilty of. He was arrested for an old insurance fraud scheme, but once the police began to investigate, his entire empire of lies and murder began to unravel. Holmes would be sentenced to death for the murder of Benjamin Pitezel. He had been so clever, so calculating, but in the end, his ego and his greed would be his undoing. As he sat in his cell, he confessed to 27 murders. The press, especially William Randolph Hearst, would pay him a lot of money to do so. The public was hungry for a monster, and Holmes was happy to give them one. He would fabricate and exaggerate his crimes, making his story more and more sensational, weaving a new tapestry of lies to impress them all, even in his final moments. It was a shocking confession that would make him a household name. But a later investigation would reveal that many of his victims were still alive and well, proving his final performance was just one more con. He was executed by hanging on May 7, 1896, and even in his last moments, he would have one final macabre request. He wanted to be buried in a cement-filled coffin to prevent his body from being disturbed. It was a final act of control from a man who had no control. The hanging was not quick. It took 15 minutes for him to die, a long, agonizing end for a man who had taken so many lives so quickly. As he dropped, the crowd would cheer, but his legend would only just begin. His final request was granted. He was buried in a grave so deep and covered in concrete that no one would ever be able to find his remains. Or so everyone thought. The legacy of H.H. Holmes would change the way we understand and study crime forever. He was a master of deception, a sociopath. He would become a blueprint for a new type of criminal. He was one of the first truly organized serial killers. He had a set method and a set motive. He was not a madman driven by impulse. He was a cold, calculating killer. The term serial killer was not yet in common use, but the legend of Holmes would help to create it. He was a modern boogeyman, a story that would spread far and wide, inspiring fear and fascination. He would become a staple of pop culture, the subject of books, movies, and TV shows. His story would be told over and over, each time a little more sensational. His legend would be forever cemented in the public's mind by the book The Devil in the White City, a book that would popularize the story of a man who built a castle of horrors for the World's Fair. In 2017, his body was exhumed, and to everyone's surprise, his body was not a skeleton. His remains had turned to sludge, but his clothes and mustache were still intact, preserved by the cement. He was identified by his teeth. The test confirmed what we all knew. He was the monster we all thought he was. The story of H.H. Holmes is a haunting one. It is a story of a monster who lived among us, a monster who was so charming, so charismatic, that he was able to deceive us all. And as you walk through the streets of Chicago today, a faint shadow of the murder castle still looms over the city, a ghostly reminder that even in the brightest of cities, there is a darkness that is always lurking just beneath the surface. It is a story that reminds us that the most terrifying monsters are not in our nightmares, but in our reality. Before you go, if this journey into the dark corners of history has left you with a lingering chill, please hit that like and subscribe button. And in the comments below, tell me, what do you believe truly motivated the darkness inside a man like H.H. Holmes?